I remember the sound before the sight, someone knocking, quick and desperate, at 3 in the morning. It was early March, still cold enough that the wind cut through the porch boards and made the house groan like something alive. When I opened the door, my daughter-in-law was standing there in the dark, hair matted against her face, eyes swollen from crying, mascara streaked down her cheeks. She was 6 months pregnant. I hadn't seen her since the day she married my son without telling us, no invitations, no calls, just photos posted online 2 days later. That night, she said 4 words I never thought I'd hear. I have nowhere else. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside and let her in. What came after wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a house when the truth finally arrives, too late to save anyone, but just in time to change everything. The living room lamp had been left on overnight. Evelyn Mercer stood in the doorway, 58 years old, retired from nursing for 3 years now, widowed for 7. Her house on Maple Street was small, 1 story, painted pale blue with white trim that needed touching up. The porch light flickered. She'd been meaning to replace the bulb for weeks. Sophie stood on the threshold, shivering despite the heavy coat she wore. The coat was thin, designed more for style than warmth, and her shoes were worn at the heels, the leather cracked and splitting. A duffel bag hung from her shoulder, canvas and faded, stuffed so full the zipper strained. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Sophie's face was pale in the yellow light, her breath coming in small white clouds. Her hands were clasped over her belly in a protective gesture that seemed instinctive. Evelyn could see the tremor in her fingers. She stepped back without a word and opened the door wider, holding it with one hand while gesturing with the other for Sophie to come inside. Sophie walked in slowly, as if afraid the floor might give way beneath her weight. She set the bag down near the couch with careful precision and stood there, hands still folded over her belly. Her coat dripped melted snow onto the hardwood floor. Evelyn closed the door, turned the deadbolt, and engaged the chain lock, habits from living alone, routines she'd developed over 7 years of widowhood. When she turned back, Sophie was watching her with red-rimmed eyes. The 2 women looked at each other across the small space. No embrace. No apology. No explanation offered or demanded. Just silence, heavy and careful, filled with everything that couldn't be said yet. The heating system clicked on, and warm air began to flow from the vents. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, a car passed slowly, its tires crunching on the salted road. "You can sleep on the couch tonight," Evelyn said quietly, her voice still rough with sleep. "Tomorrow we'll sort the guest room." Sophie nodded, a small movement, barely perceptible. She sat down on the couch without taking off her coat, without removing her shoes. She simply sat, her body folding in on itself, and placed both hands flat on her belly. Evelyn watched her for another moment, then turned and walked to the linen closet in the hallway. She pulled out a thick fleece blanket, navy blue, worn soft from years of use, and a pillow that had once belonged to her husband. She carried them back to the living room and set them on the armrest of the couch without ceremony or comment. Sophie whispered something that might have been "thank you," but the words were so soft they almost disappeared into the quiet of the house. Evelyn didn't reply. She simply nodded once, turned off the lamp, and walked down the hallway to her bedroom. She left the hallway light on, a small night light plugged into the baseboard outlet, casting a dim yellow glow that would guide Sophie if she needed to find the bathroom during the night. In her bedroom, Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without moving. She could hear the faint sounds of Sophie settling on the couch, the creak of springs, the rustle of fabric, the soft intake of breath that might have been a suppressed sob. Evelyn stared at the wall, at the framed photograph of her late husband that hung there, his face forever frozen at 51, before the cancer had taken him. She thought about her son, Daniel, and wondered what kind of man he had become that his pregnant wife would arrive at 3 in the morning with nowhere else to go. Finally, she lay down without changing out of her robe, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come for a long time. She listened to the house settle, to the wind outside, to the occasional sound of movement from the living room. When she finally drifted off, It was with the understanding that tomorrow would bring answers, whether she wanted them or not. In the morning, Evelyn woke at 6, as she always did. The habit was ingrained from decades of nursing shifts that started at 7. Even in retirement, her body refused to sleep past sunrise. She lay still for a moment, listening. The house was silent. She pushed back the quilt, stood, and pulled on her worn terrycloth robe over her nightgown. Her slippers were beside the bed, and she slid her feet into them before padding softly down the hallway. The living room was dim, the curtains still drawn. Sophie was still on the couch, curled on her side with one arm tucked under her head and the other draped protectively over her belly. The blanket had slipped to the floor sometime during the night. Evelyn picked it up, shook it out, folded it into a neat rectangle, and set it on the armchair. She didn't cover Sophie with it. Something about the woman's sleep seemed fragile, and Evelyn didn't want to risk waking her. She went to the kitchen and filled the coffee maker with water from the tap, measured out 4 scoops of grounds, and pressed the button. The machine gurgled and hissed, filling the quiet kitchen with the smell of brewing coffee. While it worked, Evelyn stood at the sink and looked out the window at the backyard. The grass was brown and matted from winter. The bird feeder hung empty from the oak tree. She made a mental note to fill it later. By the time the coffee finished brewing, Sophie had stirred. Evelyn heard the couch springs creak and heard footsteps moving slowly across the floor. She poured 2 mugs of coffee, black, and carried them to the living room. Sophie was sitting up now, her hair disheveled, her face puffy from sleep and crying. When she saw Evelyn, she froze, her expression caught somewhere between gratitude and shame. Evelyn set 1 mug on the small side table near the couch. "Cream's in the fridge," she said, her voice neutral. Sophie nodded but didn't move. She just stared at the steam rising from the mug. Evelyn sat in the armchair across from her, cradling her own mug in both hands, and took a slow sip. The coffee was too hot, but she didn't mind. The heat felt grounding. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a car started. A dog barked twice, then stopped. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked somewhere in the house. Evelyn couldn't remember which room it was in. She'd lived here so long that the sounds had become invisible, part of the texture of solitude. Finally, Sophie spoke. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go." Evelyn set her mug down on the coffee table. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. When Sophie didn't continue, Evelyn prompted gently, "What happened?" Sophie's story came out in fragments, disjointed and halting. She spoke in starts and stops, pausing sometimes for so long that Evelyn thought she might not continue. But each time, after a deep breath or a swallow of coffee, Sophie picked up the thread again. The lease on their apartment had ended suddenly. Daniel had told her he would handle the renewal. He always handled that sort of thing, the paperwork, the administrative tasks. Sophie had trusted him. But 3 days before the move-out date, the landlord had called Sophie directly, confused because no renewal request had been submitted. No notice of intent to vacate had been filed. Nothing. When Sophie called Daniel in a panic, he was short with her. He said he was in Denver for work, that it was a big project, that he couldn't talk right now. He told her to handle it herself and hung up. She'd tried to access their joint bank account to pay for a hotel room while she figured things out. The account was frozen. Or not frozen exactly, the password had been changed, and she no longer had access. She called the bank. They told her that the account holder, Daniel, had modified the access permissions 2 weeks earlier. She wasn't authorized to make changes without his consent. "He changed the password," Sophie said quietly, staring into her coffee mug. "I don't have access anymore. I don't even know how much money we have." Evelyn listened without interrupting. She kept her expression neutral, her hands folded in her lap, her posture relaxed. She'd learned long ago in nursing that people revealed more when you didn't react, when you simply held space and let the silence do its work. When Sophie finished, Evelyn asked only one question, her tone conversational, almost offhand. "When did you last speak to him?" "3 days ago. When he hung up on me." Evelyn nodded slowly. She stood, collected both mugs, Sophie's was still full, untouched, and carried them to the kitchen. She refilled her own and returned to the armchair. "You can stay here until you decide what to do," she said matter-of-factly. "But there are rules. You see a doctor this week for the baby. Any mail that comes here with your name on it, you leave unopened on the counter. I'll sort it. And if Daniel calls, you let me know immediately." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She blinked rapidly, swallowed hard, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn didn't smile. Her expression remained calm, almost detached. "I'm not doing this for him." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie nodded again, understanding what Evelyn hadn't said. This wasn't about Daniel, or even about repairing whatever relationship Evelyn had lost with her son when he'd married in secret. This was about Sophie, about the baby, about basic human decency. That afternoon, Evelyn set about making the guest room habitable. It had become a storage space over the years, boxes of old medical textbooks she couldn't bring herself to throw away, winter coats she no longer wore, a broken sewing machine she kept meaning to fix. She moved the boxes to the basement, one at a time, carrying them carefully down the narrow stairs. She took the winter coats to the donation bin at the church 2 blocks away. The sewing machine went to the curb with a sign that said "Free Works with Repair." She dusted the dresser, a solid oak piece that had belonged to her mother. She vacuumed the floor, washed the window, and wiped down the windowsill. She put fresh sheets on the bed, white cotton, crisp from the linen closet, and fluffed the pillows. She set a glass of water on the nightstand and placed a small lamp beside it, the kind with a 3-way bulb that could be adjusted from dim to bright. When she finished, she stood in the doorway and surveyed her work. The room looked spare but clean. Functional. It would do. She went back to the living room where Sophie was still sitting on the couch, exactly where Evelyn had left her. "The room's ready," Evelyn said. Sophie stood slowly, one hand on her lower back, and followed Evelyn down the hall. Sophie carried her duffel bag into the guest room and set it by the closet. She didn't unpack. She just stood there, looking around at the clean space, the made bed, the empty dresser waiting to be filled. Evelyn noticed, but said nothing. She simply nodded once and left Sophie alone, closing the door partway behind her. In her own room, Evelyn opened the bottom drawer of her desk, a heavy wooden piece that had been in this house longer than she had. Inside were old tax returns, insurance policies, receipts organized in labeled envelopes. She pushed those aside and found what she was looking for, a slim notebook with a plain blue cover. It was the kind of notebook she'd used during her nursing career to track patient information during long shifts. She hadn't written in it for years. The last entry was from 7 years ago, when her husband had died, a list of people to call, tasks to complete, administrative details that grief made impossible to remember. She flipped past those pages to a blank section. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote the date, March 3rd. Beneath it, in her neat, precise handwriting, she wrote, "Sophie arrives at 3 a.m. no notice." The lease on the apartment ended without renewal. Bank account inaccessible, password changed by Daniel. He is in Denver for work, duration unknown. She underlined Denver twice, then closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. The act of writing had a calming effect. It made the situation feel manageable, containable. Facts on a page were easier to process than the chaotic swirl of questions and implications. This was something she could control. By evening, Sophie had still not unpacked. She'd emerged from the guest room only once, to use the bathroom, and had returned immediately. Evelyn heated leftover vegetable soup from the freezer and set the table for 2. She knocked gently on the guest room door. "Dinner," she said simply, and walked away without waiting for a response. A few minutes later, Sophie appeared in the kitchen. She'd changed into clean clothes, sweatpants, and an oversized sweater that did little to hide her pregnant belly. She sat at the table without a word. Evelyn ladled soup into 2 bowls and set one in front of Sophie, along with a sleeve of crackers. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against ceramic and the soft tick of the kitchen clock. When the phone rang, Sophie flinched so hard she nearly knocked over her water glass. Evelyn caught it before it tipped, steadied it, and then stood to answer the phone. The caller ID showed Daniel's number. She picked up the receiver and, without preamble, pressed the speaker button before saying anything. "Mom," Daniel's voice came through, slightly tinny and distorted through the speaker. There was noise in the background, voices, the clatter of dishes, music playing faintly. He was in a restaurant or a bar. "Yes," Evelyn said, her tone flat. A pause. "Is she there?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. Sophie sat frozen at the table, staring at the phone. "Can I talk to her?" "She's listening." Silence. Then, carefully, as if choosing each word with precision, "Sophie, call me when you calm down." Evelyn pressed the button to end the call. She set the phone back in its cradle and returned to the table. Sophie was staring at her soup, her face blank. Evelyn sat down and resumed eating. After a long moment, Sophie picked up her spoon again. But she didn't lift it to her mouth. She just held it, staring at the surface of the soup as it cooled. Evelyn finished her meal, cleared both bowls even though Sophie had barely touched hers, and washed them by hand in the sink. She dried them with a dish towel and put them away in the cabinet. When she turned around, Sophie was still sitting at the table, motionless. "Go to bed," Evelyn said gently. "Tomorrow's soon enough for everything else." Sophie stood slowly, as if her body weighed more than she could carry. She walked to the guest room without looking back. The door closed softly. Evelyn stood at the sink for a long time, looking out the window at the dark street, the pools of yellow light from the street lamps, the shadows of bare trees swaying in the wind. Then she went to her room, opened the notebook again, and added a single line beneath the first entry. "Daniel called at 7:15 p.m. Background noise suggests public location." Tone suggests control, not concern. Instructed Sophie to calm down implies he views her distress as unreasonable or excessive. She closed the notebook, put it away, and sat on the edge of her bed. She thought about her son, about the boy he'd been, bright and restless, always moving, always asking questions. She thought about the man he'd become, the one who'd married without telling his mother, who'd left his pregnant wife with no place to go, who spoke to her with that careful, condescending tone. She didn't recognize him. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, there was only the task of sleep, of rest, of letting the mind settle so it could face what came next. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Evelyn woke at 6, made coffee, and was sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper when Sophie emerged from the guest room. She looked better rested, at least. Her face wasn't as swollen. She'd pulled her hair back into a ponytail. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the table across from Evelyn. "Thank you," Sophie said, "for last night." Evelyn turned a page of the newspaper. "You're welcome. I don't know how long I'll need to stay. We'll figure it out." Evelyn folded the paper and set it aside. "First thing is to get you to a doctor." "When was your last appointment?" 3 weeks ago. "Do you have another one scheduled?" Sophie hesitated. "It was supposed to be next week. But I don't know if my insurance is still active." "We'll find out." "What's the doctor's name?" Sophie told her. Evelyn wrote it down on a notepad she kept by the phone, along with the phone number Sophie recited from memory. "I'll call when they open," Evelyn said. "In the meantime, you should eat something." She made toast and scrambled eggs. They ate together at the table, and this time Sophie finished her plate. When they were done, Evelyn called her neighbor, Lydia Chen. Lydia was 55, a retired social worker who'd moved to Maple Street a decade ago after her divorce. She and Evelyn had become friends slowly, the way neighbors do when they wave across lawns and share pleasantries about the weather, until one day they realized they know each other's routines, their rhythms, the shape of their lives. Lydia was practical and unsentimental, traits Evelyn appreciated. She answered on the second ring. "Can you come by this afternoon?" Evelyn asked without preamble. "Everything okay? I'll explain when you're here." 2:00 work. "That's fine." Evelyn hung up and turned to Sophie. "A friend is stopping by later. She might have some advice." Sophie nodded. She didn't ask questions. Evelyn appreciated that too. At 9, Evelyn called the obstetrician's office. The receptionist confirmed Sophie's appointment for the following Tuesday. When Evelyn asked about insurance verification, the receptionist put her on hold. Elevator music played for 3 minutes. Then a different voice came on the line, older, more authoritative. "This is Janet, the office manager. I understand you're calling about Sophie Mercer's insurance." "Yes. I need to confirm it's still active. Let me pull up her file," the sound of typing. "Okay, I see here that her last visit was billed to her husband's employer plan. Let me verify the coverage," more typing. A pause. "The system shows the policy is active, but I'm seeing a flag here. It looks like there's a pending change request on the account. I can't give you details without authorization from the policyholder." "What kind of change?" "I'm sorry, I can't disclose that. You'd need to contact the insurance company directly." Evelyn thanked her and hung up. She wrote in the notepad, "Insurance, pending change. Details restricted." She underlined pending twice. Lydia arrived at 2 o'clock as promised. She came to the door with a covered dish balanced in one hand and a canvas tote bag in the other. Evelyn let her in and gestured toward the kitchen. Lydia set the dish on the counter. It was still warm, something with chicken and rice, and turned to Evelyn with a questioning look. "Is this about Daniel?" Lydia asked quietly. She knew about the secret wedding. Everyone in Evelyn's small circle knew. It had been impossible to hide. "Yes. And his wife." Evelyn told her everything, keeping her voice low and factual. Lydia listened without interrupting, her arms crossed, her expression growing progressively more serious. When Evelyn finished, Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Where's she now?" "Resting in the guest room." Lydia nodded slowly. "How long is she staying?" "I don't know yet. As long as she needs to, I suppose." Lydia studied Evelyn's face. "You're taking this very calmly. What good would panic do?" "None. But most mothers would be furious at their sons right now." Evelyn poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Lydia. "I'm sure I'll be furious eventually. Right now, I'm just trying to understand what happened." Lydia sipped her coffee. "You'll want documentation. Everything. Dates, times, phone calls, anything he sends. Mail especially." "I know." Lydia set her cup down and reached into her tote bag. She pulled out a pack of manila folders and a box of sticky tabs in multiple colors. She set them on the table. "Start now. Don't wait. Memory gets fuzzy fast, especially when emotions get involved. Write down everything that's happened so far while it's still fresh." Evelyn took the folders. "Thank you. I mean it, Evelyn. Every phone call. Every piece of mail. If he shows up, document that too. Date, time, what was said. If things get legal, and they might, you'll need a record." "I understand." Lydia finished her coffee and stood. "I'll check in tomorrow. And if you need anything at all, you call me. I don't care what time it is." After Lydia left, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the manila folders. She labeled the first one in her neat handwriting, Sophie March. She placed it on the counter, empty for now but ready. Then she went to her room and retrieved the blue notebook. She sat at the table and transcribed her notes onto fresh paper, expanding them with additional details she remembered. The background noise on Daniel's call. The exact wording of his message to Sophie. The receptionist's careful phrasing about the insurance flag. When she finished, she had 3 pages of notes. She dated each page, put them in the folder, and closed it. The act felt ceremonial, significant. She was building something, though she didn't yet know exactly what. That evening, the mail arrived. Evelyn heard the distinctive metal clang of the mailbox lid and went to retrieve it. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a thick envelope addressed to Sophie Mercer. The return address was a law firm in Columbus, Peterson and Associates. Evelyn recognized the name. They specialized in family law. She carried the mail inside and set it on the counter without opening anything. When Sophie emerged from the guest room an hour later, Evelyn pointed to the envelope. "This came for you." Sophie picked it up, looked at the return address, and went very still. She turned the envelope over in her hands, examining it as if it might explode. Then she set it back down on the counter without opening it. "I'll deal with it later. You should open it now." "I don't want to." Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. Ignoring it won't make it go away. Sophie stared at the envelope for a long moment. Finally, she picked it up again and tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She read it twice, her face draining of color, then handed it to Evelyn without a word. It was a notice from the landlord's attorney regarding the lease termination and a formal request for Sophie to provide a forwarding address within 10 business days for the return of the security deposit. The letter was dated 5 days ago. Daniel's name was copied at the bottom, indicating he'd received the same notice. Evelyn read it carefully, then looked at Sophie. "He didn't tell you about this?" "No." "Did he tell you he wasn't renewing the lease?" "No. He said he was handling it." Evelyn folded the letter and placed it inside the manila folder. She wrote on a sticky tab, "Lease termination notice, landlord's attorney, dated February 27th, received March 4th. Sophie was unaware until now. Daniel received a copy but did not inform her. She pressed the tab onto the letter and closed the folder. Sophie watched her work. "What are you doing?" "Keeping track." "Of what?" "Of everything." Evelyn looked at her. "If you decide to take any kind of legal action later, you'll need a record." "I'm making 1 inch." Sophie's eyes filled with tears again. This time, they spilled over. She wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I don't even know if I want to do anything. I don't know what I want." "That's okay. You don't have to decide today. But when you're ready to decide, you'll have the information you need." Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern developed. Sophie woke late and spent most of the day in the guest room or on the porch when the weather permitted. She was quiet, withdrawn, but not hostile. She helped with small tasks when Evelyn asked, folding laundry, setting the table, but mostly kept to herself. Evelyn didn't push. She understood that grief and confusion needed space. More mail arrived. An insurance premium notice addressed to both Daniel and Sophie. A bank statement for the joint account Sophie could no longer access. A promotional mailer from a credit card company offering balance transfers. Evelyn logged each piece of mail in her notebook, noting the sender, the date received, and any details that seemed inconsistent or significant. The insurance notice was particularly interesting. It listed a contact address for Daniel in Denver, a street Evelyn didn't recognize. She looked it up online. It was a high-rise apartment building downtown, expensive, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a rooftop pool. Not the kind of place someone stayed temporarily for work. She printed a screenshot of the building's website and added it to the folder with a note. Daniel's Denver address per insurance notice, luxury building, suggests permanence, not temporary work assignment. The bank statement was enlightening in its own way. Though Sophie couldn't access the account, the statement showed recent transactions. Most were unremarkable: grocery stores, gas stations, a few restaurants. But one caught Evelyn's eye: a charge from a furniture store in Denver for just over $3,000. She circled it and added a note: large furniture purchase, indicates establishing residence. Daniel called twice more during those weeks. The first time, he asked if Sophie was behaving. Evelyn's response was short and neutral. "She's fine." He asked if she'd found a place yet. Evelyn said no. He made a sound of frustration and hung up. Evelyn noted the call in her notebook. March 10th, 4:30 p.m. Daniel called, asked if Sophie had found other housing. Tone impatient, bordering on hostile. No inquiry about her health or the baby. The second call came a week later. This time, Daniel's tone was different, sharper, more demanding. "Where's the title to my car?" "I don't have it." "Sophie does." "Tell her I need it." "Why?" "That's none of your business." "Just tell her. If you want to talk to her yourself. She won't answer when I call." "I wonder why." A pause. "Don't do this, Mom." "Do what?" "Make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not making anything hard. I'm just letting her stay here until she figures out what to do." Another pause, longer this time. "Tell her I need the title by the end of the week." He hung up without saying goodbye. Evelyn noted this call as well, recording the date, time, and exact wording. Then she asked Sophie about the car title. Sophie retrieved it from her duffel bag, still unpacked, Evelyn noticed, and handed it to Evelyn. "Why does he want it?" "He didn't say." "Do you want me to send it to him?" Sophie thought about it. No, not yet. If he wants it, he can ask me himself. Evelyn put the title in the folder and added a note. Car title requested by Daniel on March 17th. The title remains in Sophie's possession at her request. Vehicle registered in Daniel's name only. By the end of March, Sophie had her next prenatal appointment. Evelyn drove her to the clinic in her old Honda Civic. The drive took 15 minutes. They didn't talk much. Sophie stared out the window at the bare trees and gray sky. When they arrived, Evelyn parked and followed Sophie inside. The waiting room was small and cheerful, decorated with posters about prenatal nutrition and fetal development. Soft music played from speakers in the ceiling. 3 other women sat in various stages of pregnancy, flipping through magazines or staring at their phones. Sophie checked in at the desk, and they sat down to wait. 20 minutes later, a nurse called Sophie's name. She disappeared through a door, and Evelyn was left alone with a magazine she didn't read. She stared at the same page for 10 minutes without processing a single word. Her mind kept circling back to the folder on her kitchen counter, to the insurance notice, to Daniel's voice on the phone saying, "Tell her I need the title by the end of the week," as if Sophie were an employee he could issue orders to. When Sophie returned 30 minutes later, she was carrying a new printout of an ultrasound image. She showed it to Evelyn without comment. The image was grainy and abstract, but Evelyn could make out the curve of a spine, the round shape of a head. "She looks good," Evelyn said, handing it back. Sophie nodded and tucked the image into her purse. On the drive home, Sophie finally spoke. They asked about insurance again. "What did you tell them?" "That I'm covered under Daniel's plan. They said they'd verify it and call me if there's a problem." "Did they say anything else?" "Just that everything looks normal with the baby. Blood pressure's a little high, but not concerning yet. They want me to come back in 2 weeks." Evelyn nodded. When they got home, she added the ultrasound date to her notebook and made a note about the blood pressure. She also noted that the insurance verification was still pending. 2 days later, the insurance company called. Evelyn answered. A customer service representative with a pleasant, professional voice introduced herself as Jennifer. "I'm calling to discuss the coverage for Sophie Mercer." "Yes. Our records show that Sophie is listed as a dependent on a policy held by Daniel Mercer through his employer. Is that correct?" "As far as I know, yes. I need to inform you that there's a pending change request on this policy. The policyholder has requested to remove Sophie as a dependent effective June 1st. Evelyn's hand tightened on the phone. "Remove her?" "Yes. The change is scheduled to take effect on the 1st of June. If Sophie needs continued coverage, she'll need to apply for her own policy before that date. She's 6 months pregnant." A pause. "I understand. Unfortunately, the policyholder has the right to make changes to dependent coverage. I can send you information about individual policies if that would be helpful." "Yes. Send it." Jennifer took down Evelyn's address and promised the information would arrive within 5 business days. When Evelyn hung up, she stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall. Then she opened the notebook and wrote, "Insurance company called March 29th. Daniel has requested removal of Sophie as dependent, effective June 1st. Sophie is currently 6 months pregnant. Change request indicates intent to leave her uninsured during the final trimester and birth." She underlined the final sentence 3 times. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Evelyn sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the last light fade from the sky. She thought about patterns. In nursing, patterns were everything. A spike in temperature followed by a drop in blood pressure. A change in breathing followed by a change in pulse. Patterns told you what was coming before it arrived. They gave you time to prepare. Daniel's pattern was becoming clear. The lease was abandoned. The bank account was made inaccessible. The beneficiary changes on the insurance policy. The furniture purchase in Denver. The woman in the photos. And now, the scheduled removal of Sophie's health coverage just as she entered her 3rd trimester. Each action, taken alone, could be explained. Together, they formed a picture. He was preparing to leave her completely. And he was doing it methodically, step by step, closing off her access to resources and protections before she even realized what was happening. The only question was why he hadn't just filed for divorce yet. Perhaps he was waiting until after the baby was born. Perhaps he was trying to position things so that when he did file, he would appear to be the responsible party and Sophie would appear to be the one who'd left. Evelyn finished her tea and went inside. She locked the door behind her and turned off all the lights except the hallway nightlight. In her room, she sat at her desk and opened the notebook again. On a fresh page, she began constructing a timeline. She listed every significant event in chronological order, from the secret wedding to tonight's phone call. She drew lines connecting events that seemed related. She added question marks next to things she didn't yet understand. When she finished, it was past 11. Her hand ached from writing. But the timeline was complete, and it told a story. Not a complete story. There were still gaps, still unknowns, but enough of a story that Evelyn could see where it was heading. She closed the notebook, put it away, and went to bed. But she didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark, listening to the house settle, thinking about what came next. April arrived with warmer weather and longer days. The trees began to bud. Evelyn planted tomatoes in the backyard, in raised beds her husband had built 15 years ago. She weeded the flower beds along the front walk and filled the bird feeder that hung from the oak tree. Sophie helped sometimes, kneeling awkwardly to pull weeds or holding the seed bag while Evelyn filled the feeder. They didn't talk much during these tasks. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that develops between people who've learned each other's rhythms. Sophie moved more slowly now, her belly larger and more cumbersome. She rested often, sitting on the porch steps with one hand on her lower back. Evelyn watched her from the corner of her eye, monitoring for signs of distress, but Sophie seemed well enough. Tired, but well. One afternoon in mid-April, Lydia stopped by with a casserole and a folder of her own. They sat on the porch while Sophie was inside, napping. Lydia handed Evelyn the folder. "My friend, the family lawyer. Elizabeth Hart. Here's her card and some intake forms. If Sophie decides she wants to explore her options, Elizabeth's the one to call." Evelyn took the folder and opened it. Inside was a business card, several blank forms with headings like asset inventory and financial disclosure, and a pamphlet about divorce and custody in Ohio. She read the pamphlet carefully, noting the sections about marital property and spousal support. "Has she said anything about what she wants to do?" Lydia asked. "No, I don't think she knows yet." "That's understandable. But she should at least talk to someone. Get information. She doesn't have to make any decisions, but she should know what her options are." "I'll suggest it." They sat in silence for a while, drinking iced tea and watching a robin hop across the lawn. Finally, Lydia said, "How are you doing with all this?" Evelyn shrugged. "I'm fine. Are you angry at him?" "Not yet. Mostly I'm just observing." "That's very zen of you. Or very nurse-like. When you're in the middle of a crisis, you don't have time for feelings. You just do what needs to be done. The feelings come later." Lydia nodded. "Just make sure they do come. Suppressing everything isn't healthy." "I know. But right now, Sophie needs stability. She needs someone who isn't falling apart. I can fall apart later." That evening, Evelyn showed Sophie the folder from Lydia. Sophie looked through it slowly, reading the pamphlet, examining the forms. When she finished, she closed the folder and handed it back to Evelyn. "I don't know if I want a divorce. You don't have to decide right now. But it might be worth talking to a lawyer anyway, just to understand what your rights are, what your options are. Information doesn't commit you to anything." Sophie thought about it. "Okay, maybe. Can I think about it?" "Of course." A week later, more mail arrived. This time it was a thick envelope with a Denver postmark, addressed to Daniel Mercer but forwarded to Evelyn's address. Sophie saw it first and brought it to Evelyn. "It's for him. But I think you should open it." Evelyn hesitated. Opening someone else's mail was technically illegal, even if it was her son's and even if it had been forwarded. But Sophie handed her the envelope with such quiet insistence that Evelyn relented. She opened it carefully, preserving the envelope in case she needed to prove she hadn't tampered with it maliciously. Inside was a packet of documents from an insurance company, not the health insurance, but a life insurance policy. The cover letter thanked Daniel for updating his beneficiary information and enclosed the new policy documents reflecting the changes he'd requested. Attached was a beneficiary designation form with Daniel's signature at the bottom, dated April 9th. The primary beneficiary line, which had previously listed Sophie Mercer, now listed Clara Vaughn. Sophie's name had been crossed out and initiated by Daniel. The secondary beneficiary line listed Daniel's mother, Evelyn herself, but only for 25% of the policy value. Clara Vaughn was designated to receive 75%. Evelyn read the form twice, then set it on the table. Sophie leaned over and looked at it. Her face went very still, all expression draining away. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the paper as if it were written in a language she couldn't quite comprehend. "Who's Clara Vaughn?" Sophie finally asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know." Evelyn picked up the envelope, checked the postmark, April 15th, and placed everything inside the manila folder. She wrote on a new sticky tab, "Life insurance beneficiary change. Primary beneficiary changed from Sophie to Clara Vaughn, 75%. Secondary beneficiary Evelyn Mercer, 25%. Form signed April 9th. Documents mailed April 15th. Sophie, previously primary beneficiary, now completely removed. Change made while Sophie was 6+ months pregnant." She pressed the tab onto the form and closed the folder. Sophie was still staring at the table where the paper had been. "He replaced me," she said softly. "While I'm pregnant with his child, he replaced me." Evelyn said nothing. What could she say? The evidence was there in black ink and red initials. Instead, she made tea and set a cup in front of Sophie. They sat together at the kitchen table in silence while the afternoon light slanted through the windows and the clock ticked on the wall. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed early, Evelyn sat on the porch with her notebook. She opened it to the timeline page and added the beneficiary change. Then she sat back and studied the complete picture. The timeline now showed: July, secret wedding, discovered via social media. February 27th, lease termination notice sent. Sophie not informed. Early March, bank account password changed. Sophie loses access. March 3rd. Sophie arrives at Evelyn's house March 10th and 17. Daniel's calls, demanding no concern for Sophie or baby. March 29th. Insurance company confirms Sophie's health coverage to be terminated June 1st. April 9th. Life insurance beneficiary changed. Sophie removed. Clara Vaughn added. April 15th. Beneficiary change. Documents mailed. Evelyn drew a line connecting Clara Vaughn to the luxury apartment building in Denver. She added a question mark next to it. Who was Clara Vaughn? A colleague? A girlfriend? Someone Daniel had met after moving to Denver, or someone he'd known before? She was about to close the notebook when her phone rang. The number was blocked. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello. Is this Evelyn Mercer?" A man's voice, unfamiliar, speaking quietly as if he didn't want to be overheard. "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name is Marcus Lane. I work with your son at Tech Solutions." Evelyn's hand tightened on the phone. "Go on." A pause. She could hear him breathing, could hear background noise, the hum of traffic, the distant sound of voices. He was outside somewhere. "I'm calling because I think you should know something. About Daniel." "I'm listening." He's not the same man he was when he started here. Something changed about 6 months ago. He's been distracted. Making mistakes. We've had complaints from clients." Another pause. "And there's a woman. She works in our Denver office. Clara Vaughn. They've been seeing each other. I've seen them together." "How long?" "I'm not sure. A few months at least. Maybe longer. Some people think it started before he moved to Denver. That might be why he requested the transfer." Evelyn absorbed this. "Why are you telling me this?" A longer pause. "Because it's not right. He has a pregnant wife. And I know she moved out, but from what I've heard, it wasn't her choice. I thought someone in his family should know. Before it's too late." "Too late for what?" "I don't know. But something's not right. He's been acting strange. Secretive. And I saw his name on some paperwork last week that worried me." What kind of paperwork? I can't say. I shouldn't even be calling you. But just be careful. Document everything. I think he's planning something. The line went dead. Evelyn sat on the porch, staring at her phone. After a moment, she opened the notebook and added a new entry. April 16th, 8:45 p.m. Received a call from Marcus Lane, Daniel's colleague at Tech Solutions. Reports Daniel has been involved with Clara Vaughn, works in Denver office, for a few months at least, maybe longer. The relationship may predate Daniel's transfer to Denver. Marcus reports Daniel acting strange and saw concerning paperwork, but couldn't provide details. Marcus advised to document everything and suggested Daniel plan something. One of the calls suggested genuine concern. She underlined document everything and planning something, then she sat back and looked at the notebook, at the pages and pages of notes, at the timeline that was becoming a map of betrayal. The pattern was complete now. Daniel hadn't simply drifted away from his wife. He'd systematically dismantled her life, removing her access to money, to healthcare, to any security. He'd done it while she was pregnant, while she was most vulnerable. And he'd done it for Clara Vaughn, whoever she was. Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger yet, that would come. But something colder and sharper. Clarity. The kind of clarity that came from finally seeing the truth without the fog of hope or denial obscuring it. Her son had become someone she didn't recognize. Someone she didn't respect. And Sophie and the baby deserved better. She closed the notebook and stood. Inside, the house was quiet. The nightlight glowed in the hallway. She checked on Sophie. The guest room door was slightly ajar, and she could see Sophie's shape under the blankets, hear her steady breathing. Pregnant women slept heavily, Evelyn remembered from her nursing days. Their bodies needed the rest. Evelyn went to her own room but didn't prepare for bed yet. Instead, she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She searched for Clara Vaughn Denver Tech Solutions and found a LinkedIn profile. The profile photo showed a woman in her early 30s, attractive, with dark hair and a professional smile. Her job title was Senior Project Manager. Her profile said she'd been with Tech Solutions for 4 years, all of it in the Denver office. Evelyn saved a screenshot of the profile and printed it. She added it to the folder with a note. Clara Vaughn, Senior Project Manager at Tech Solutions Denver office, age approximately 30 to 32, employed by same company as Daniel for 4 years. Per Marcus Lane, involved with Daniel for a few months at least, maybe longer. She looked at the photo for a long time. This was the woman Daniel had chosen over Sophie. Over his unborn child. Over the vows he'd made in that secret courthouse ceremony. Evelyn felt no hatred for Clara Vaughn. She didn't know her, didn't know the whole story. Perhaps Clara didn't know Daniel was married. Perhaps she was as much a victim as Sophie. Or perhaps she'd known and hadn't cared. Evelyn didn't know, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the pattern, the timeline, the evidence of Daniel's choices. She filed the screenshot and closed the folder. Then she turned off the computer and sat in the dark for a while, thinking. By early May, Sophie had begun to show signs of nesting. She cleaned the guest room meticulously, organizing her few belongings. She asked if she could help Evelyn with the spring cleaning, and together they washed windows, vacuumed under furniture, wiped down baseboards. The physical work seemed to help Sophie. She moved with more purpose, more energy. Color returned to her cheeks. One afternoon, Sophie asked, "Do you think I should call that lawyer?" Evelyn was folding laundry at the kitchen table. She didn't look up. "Do you think you should?" "I don't know. I keep thinking maybe he'll come back. Maybe he'll apologize and we can work it out. Do you want that?" Sophie was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "I don't know that either. I just don't want to give up if there is still a chance." Evelyn set down the towel she was folding and looked at Sophie. "That's understandable. But you should know what your rights are regardless. Talking to a lawyer doesn't mean filing for divorce. It just means getting information." Sophie nodded slowly. "Okay. Can you call her for me?" That afternoon, Evelyn called Elizabeth Hart's office. The receptionist answered with a cheerful greeting and put Evelyn through when she mentioned Lydia's name. Elizabeth picked up on the second ring. "Evelyn." Lydia told me you might call. I'm calling on behalf of my daughter-in-law. She's staying with me. She's 7 months pregnant, and her husband has basically abandoned her. She's ready to talk to someone about her options. Can she come in on Thursday? I have an opening at 10-inch. I'll bring her. Elizabeth gave her the address, a small office on Main Street, above a bakery, and they confirmed the appointment. When Evelyn hung up, Sophie looked nervous. What if she tells me I don't have any options? Then at least you'll know. But I doubt that's what she'll say. Thursday arrived gray and drizzly. Evelyn and Sophie drove to Main Street in silence. They found parking easily and climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor. The office was small but professional, decorated in soothing blues and greens. The receptionist smiled and offered them coffee. They declined. Elizabeth Hart appeared 5 minutes later. She was 52, Evelyn guessed, with short gray hair and glasses on a chain around her neck. She wore slacks and a cardigan, and her handshake was firm. She led them into her office, a cozy space with a desk, 2 client chairs, and a bookshelf filled with legal volumes. Thank you for seeing us, Evelyn said. Of course. Elizabeth settled into her chair and opened a legal pad. So, Lydia tells me you're in a difficult situation. Tell me everything. Sophie told her story again, this time with more detail. Elizabeth listened intently, taking notes occasionally. When Sophie mentioned the insurance termination and the beneficiary change, Elizabeth's eyebrows went up. Do you have copies of those documents? My mother-in-law does. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out the folder. She'd brought copies of everything, the insurance notices, the beneficiary forms, the lease termination letter, the bank statements. Elizabeth spread them on her desk and reviewed them carefully, her expression growing increasingly serious. When she finished, she looked up at Sophie. You've been systematically isolated. Your husband has removed your access to finances, your health insurance is being terminated right before you give birth, and he's changed beneficiaries to exclude you entirely. This is not accidental. This is deliberate. Sophie's voice was small. What can I do? Several things. First, you can file for emergency spousal support. Given that you're pregnant and without resources, the court would likely grant it. Second, you can request a protective order on marital assets. If there are joint accounts or property, we can freeze them so he can't dissipate everything before you file for divorce. Third, you can petition for health insurance coverage through his employer. Courts can mandate that he maintain your coverage pending the resolution of the marriage. Will all that make him angry? Elizabeth's voice was gentle but firm. Probably. But he's already angry, Sophie. Or at least, he's already decided to cut you out of his life. These actions are about protecting you and your baby. Not about making him happy. Sophie looked at Evelyn. Evelyn nodded. Sophie turned back to Elizabeth. What do I need to do? First, I need you to fill out these intake forms. Then I need you to go home and make a list of every asset you know about. Bank accounts, retirement accounts, property, vehicles, anything. Even if you don't have access to it anymore, write it down. We'll need that information for the asset protection order. Elizabeth handed Sophie a stack of forms. Bring these back next week. In the meantime, Evelyn, keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Every phone call, every piece of mail, every interaction. The more evidence we have of his pattern of behavior, the stronger our case. I have been. Good. Then you're already ahead of the game. They left the office with the forms and drove home in silence. Sophie seemed shell-shocked. When they pulled into the driveway, she said quietly, I didn't think it would be like this. Like what? Legal. Official. Like we're going to war. Evelyn turned off the engine. You're not going to war. You're protecting yourself. There's a difference. That evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table and filled out the intake forms. Evelyn sat across from her, helping when needed. They made a list of assets together. The joint bank account. Daniel's retirement account through his employer. The car he demanded the title for. The furniture in the Denver apartment. Their shared belongings that were still in storage somewhere. Sophie didn't even know where. When they finished, it was past 10. Sophie looked exhausted. Evelyn made her chamomile tea and sent her to bed. Then she sat alone at the table and updated her notebook with the details of the meeting with Elizabeth. She added a new section: legal strategy, emergency spousal support, asset protection order, court-mandated insurance coverage. She was writing when her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "This is Marcus. Thought you should know Daniel put in for a transfer to the Houston office. Looks like he's leaving Denver. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "Thank you. I appreciate you keeping me informed." His response came a minute later, "No problem. Just seemed like the right thing to do." She added the information to her notebook. May 6th, 10:40 p.m. Text from Marcus Lane. "Daniel has requested transfer to Houston office. Suggests plan to leave Denver, and presumably Clara Vaughn. Pattern continues. Establish relationships, extract what's needed, move on." She closed the notebook and sat in the dark kitchen, thinking. The pattern was clear now. Daniel was a runner. When things got complicated or uncomfortable, he moved. He'd run from his marriage when it became difficult. He'd run to Denver for Clara Vaughn. And now he was preparing to run from Denver too. Perhaps Clara had become demanding. Perhaps she wanted more than he was willing to give. Or perhaps he'd simply gotten what he wanted from her and was ready to move on to the next thing. Evelyn felt a deep, cold sadness settle over her. This was her son. The child she'd raised, nursed through fevers, driven to soccer practice, helped with homework. Somewhere along the way, he'd become this person, this man who ran from commitment, who used people and discarded them when they became inconvenient. She didn't know when it had happened or why. But it had happened, and there was no undoing it. She went to bed but didn't sleep well. She dreamed of her husband, of conversations they'd had about parenting, about what they hoped their son would become. In the dream, her husband was shaking his head sadly, saying, "We tried our best," and Evelyn was saying it wasn't enough. When she woke at dawn, her pillow was damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. By mid-May, Sophie had completed all the intake forms and returned them to Elizabeth. The lawyer reviewed them and began preparing the paperwork for the emergency spousal support petition and the asset protection order. "This will take about a week," Elizabeth explained. "Then we'll file with the court. Once we file, Daniel will be served. That's when things will get real." "What do you mean?" "I mean he'll know that you're taking legal action. He'll probably contact you. He might be angry. He might try to convince you to drop it. You need to be prepared for that." Sophie nodded nervously. "Okay." "And you," Elizabeth said, turning to Evelyn. "You'll need to be prepared too. He might blame you for encouraging this. He might say things that are hurtful or untrue. Don't engage. Just document what he says and report it to me." "I understand." The paperwork was filed on May 19th. The court assigned a hearing date for June 3rd to review the petitions. In the meantime, Daniel would be served with notice of the petitions and given an opportunity to respond. Elizabeth explained that the service would likely happen within a week. On May 23rd, Evelyn's phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. Daniel's number. She let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello. What the hell is going on?" His voice was tight with anger. "You'll have to be more specific." "I just got served with court papers. Emergency spousal support? Asset freeze? What is this?" Sophie filed for protection. "Protection from what? I haven't done anything to her." Evelyn's voice remained calm. "You terminated her health insurance while she's pregnant. You changed your bank password so she can't access money. You removed her as beneficiary on your life insurance. You abandoned your lease without telling her. What would you call that? That's between me and her. It's none of your business. She's living in my house because you left her with nowhere to go. That makes it my business. She can get a job. She's 7 months pregnant. That's not my problem." Evelyn felt something cold and hard solidify in her chest. "Actually, it is. She's pregnant with your child. That is exactly your problem. I don't have time for this. Tell her to drop the petitions or things are going to get ugly." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning. I'll let her know you called. But I doubt she'll drop anything." He hung up without another word. Evelyn stood in her kitchen, holding the phone, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over her. She opened the notebook and recorded every word she could remember, noting the date, time, and tone of Daniel's voice. Then she called Elizabeth and reported the conversation. "That's actually helpful," Elizabeth said. "His anger and threats show that he's rattled." "That's good for us. Keep documenting. And if he calls again, don't engage. Just let it go to voicemail." 3 days later, another call came. This time, Evelyn didn't answer. Daniel left a voicemail. His voice was calmer now, more measured. "Mom, call me back. We need to talk about this rationally. I know Sophie's been saying things, but you're not getting the whole story. Just call me." Evelyn saved the voicemail and transcribed it into her notebook. She did not call him back. The court hearing arrived on June 3rd. Evelyn, Sophie, and Elizabeth appeared at 9 in the morning. They waited in a small anteroom outside the courtroom. Daniel arrived at 9:15 with his own lawyer, a young man in a gray suit who looked uncomfortable. Daniel didn't make eye contact with Sophie or Evelyn. He sat on the opposite side of the room and stared at his phone. When they were called into the courtroom, the judge, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and reading glasses, reviewed the paperwork quickly. She asked Daniel's lawyer if his client disputed any of the facts presented in the petitions. The lawyer said yes. They disputed the characterization of Daniel's actions as abandonment and isolation. The judge looked up over her glasses. "Did your client terminate the health insurance coverage?" "The coverage hasn't been terminated yet. It's scheduled to end on June 1st. So, 3 days ago." "Yes. While his wife is in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy. He has the right to make changes to his dependent coverage." "He has the right. That doesn't mean it's not evidence of intent." The judge made a note. "Did he change the password on their joint bank account?" "He secured the account to prevent unauthorized withdrawals." "By his wife, who was authorized as a joint account holder." The lawyer hesitated. "Yes." The judge made another note. She reviewed the beneficiary change documents, the lease termination letter, the asset list Sophie had provided. When she finished, she looked at Daniel directly. "Mr. Mercer, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Daniel stood. "Your Honor, I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm just trying to protect myself financially while we figure things out. By leaving your pregnant wife without access to money or health care, she has options. She can work. She can apply for Medicaid. You have a job with benefits. She's living with your mother because you left her homeless. That doesn't sound like someone with options." Daniel didn't respond. The judge turned to Elizabeth. "I'm granting the emergency spousal support petition. Mr. Mercer will pay $1,500 per month, effective immediately, until a final support order is entered. I'm also granting the asset protection order. All marital assets are frozen pending a full inventory and valuation. And I'm ordering Mr. Mercer to maintain health insurance coverage for Mrs. Mercer through his employer until this case is resolved. If he fails to comply with any of these orders, he'll be held in contempt." She signed the orders and handed them to the bailiff. Next case. Outside the courtroom, Daniel approached Sophie. Evelyn moved between them. "Don't," she said quietly. Daniel glared at her but didn't push past. Instead, he turned to Sophie. "This isn't over." Sophie's voice was shaky but clear. "Yes, it is." He walked away without another word. Elizabeth handed Evelyn copies of the signed orders. "Keep these safe. If he violates any of them, call me immediately." On the drive home, Sophie was silent. Evelyn glanced at her occasionally. When they pulled into the driveway, Sophie finally spoke. "Do you think I did the right thing?" "Do you?" "I don't know. I feel like I just declared war on the father of my child." "You didn't declare war. You protected yourself. There's a difference." Sophie nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She went inside and disappeared into the guest room. Evelyn sat in the car for a moment longer, looking at the house, at the pale blue paint and white trim. It looked peaceful. Ordinary. A place where nothing dramatic ever happened. But inside those walls, a quiet revolution was taking place. A woman was finding her strength. A mother was reclaiming her peace. And a son was learning that actions had consequences. Evelyn went inside, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. She updated the timeline with the court hearing results. Then she started a new section, post-hearing actions. She had a feeling she'd be adding to it soon. She was right. 2 weeks later, on June 17th, Daniel called again. This time, he left a voicemail that was almost conciliatory. "Mom, I know you're mad at me. I get it. But can we just talk? I want to explain my side. I'm still your son." Evelyn listened to the message twice, then saved it. She did not call back. She added a note to her log, June 17th, Fort 1 p.m. voicemail from Daniel requesting conversation. Tone conciliatory, possibly strategic. Did not return a call. 3 days after that, a letter arrived, addressed to Sophie. It was from Daniel, handwritten. Sophie opened it at the kitchen table with Evelyn sitting across from her. The letter was 2 pages long. In it, Daniel apologized for how things had gotten messy and said he wanted to work things out for the sake of the baby. He asked Sophie to call him so they could talk, without lawyers involved. Sophie read it twice, then handed it to Evelyn. Evelyn read it carefully, noting the vague language, the lack of specific apologies, the way he framed himself as the reasonable party being forced into legal action by others. When she finished, she handed it back. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe him. And the other part remembers everything that happened. The insurance. The bank account." Clara Vaughn. Evelyn nodded. "You should show this to Elizabeth." They drove to Elizabeth's office the next day. Elizabeth read the letter, then set it down. "This is classic manipulation. He's trying to get you to drop the legal protections so he can regain control. If you talk to him without the court orders in place, you're vulnerable again. But what if he means it? What if he really wants to work things out? Then he can prove it by complying with the court orders and going through the proper legal channels. If his intentions are genuine, he won't be threatened by having protections in place." Sophie looked at Evelyn. Evelyn said gently, "You don't have to decide right now. You can think about it." That evening, Sophie asked Evelyn, "Did you ever regret marrying Dad?" They were sitting on the porch, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. "No," she finally said. "Not even when things were hard. But your situation is different from mine." "How?" "Your father never lied to me. He never tried to control me. When things got difficult, we faced them together. That's not what Daniel's doing." Sophie nodded slowly. "I think I knew that. I just needed to hear it. You're allowed to hope. But hope doesn't mean ignoring evidence." They sat in silence as the darkness deepened and the fireflies multiplied. Evelyn felt an ache in her chest, not quite grief, not quite anger. Something in between. A sadness for what could have been, for the son she'd hoped Daniel would become, for the family that might have existed if he'd made different choices. By early July, Sophie was in her final month of pregnancy. She moved slowly, her belly enormous, her feet swollen. Evelyn helped her with everything, tying her shoes, reaching items on high shelves, carrying laundry up and down the stairs. They prepared the nursery together, painting the walls a soft yellow and setting up the old cradle Evelyn had pulled from the attic. Daniel's court-ordered support payments arrived on time, $1,500, deposited electronically on the 1st of the month. Elizabeth confirmed that his employer was maintaining Sophie's health insurance coverage as ordered. The asset freeze remained in place. For now, at least, the legal protections were holding. One afternoon in mid-July, Evelyn received an unexpected visitor. She answered the door to find a woman in her early 30s standing on the porch. She had dark hair, pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore jeans and a simple blouse. "Are you Evelyn Mercer?" "Yes." "Who are you?" "My name is Clara Vaughn." Evelyn's hand tightened on the doorframe. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Evelyn said, "What do you want?" "I wanted to talk to you. About Daniel. I don't think we have anything to discuss." Clara's voice was quiet. "Please. Just 5 minutes." Evelyn considered refusing. But curiosity won out. She stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her, putting herself between Clara and the house. "Talk." Clara took a breath. "I wanted you to know that I didn't know he was married when we met. He told me he was separated. He said the relationship was over. I believed him. When did you find out the truth? Last month. Someone at work mentioned his wife was pregnant. I confronted him. He admitted everything. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I ended it immediately. But I wanted to come here and tell you and her that I didn't know. I would never have gotten involved if I'd known. Evelyn studied her face. Clara looked genuinely distressed. Why are you telling me this? Because I feel terrible. And because I thought you should know that he's been lying to everyone. Not just his wife. Me too. Probably other people. I don't know. Is he still in Denver? No. He left 2 weeks ago. Put in for a transfer to Houston. I don't know if it went through. Evelyn nodded slowly. Thank you for coming. I believe you. Clara wiped her eyes. Tell her I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. She turned and walked back to her car. Evelyn watched her drive away, then went inside. Sophie was in the nursery, folding tiny clothes. Evelyn told her about Clara's visit. Sophie listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, Sophie said simply, "Okay. That's all? Just okay? What else is there to say? He lied to everyone. That's who he is." Evelyn sat down on the floor beside her and helped fold the tiny clothes. They worked in silence, creating order out of chaos, one small item at a time. July faded into August. The heat was oppressive. Evelyn ran fans in every room and kept the curtains drawn during the day. Sophie spent most of her time in the living room, lying on the couch with her feet elevated, reading baby books and trying to stay cool. Her due date was August 23rd, but the doctor had warned she might deliver early. On August 12th, Sophie went into labor at 3 in the morning. Evelyn woke to the sound of her calling from the guest room. She rushed in to find Sophie sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing hard. It's time. They drove to the hospital through empty streets. Evelyn held Sophie's hand in the emergency room while they checked her in. The contractions were strong and regular. The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, getting Sophie into a gown and into a delivery room. Evelyn stayed by her side, offering water, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, coaching her breathing when the pain became too intense. The labor lasted 14 hours. It was hard and exhausting, but Sophie never complained. She gritted her teeth and pushed when they told her to push, breathed when they told her to breathe. Evelyn stayed with her the entire time, never leaving, never resting. She delivered babies herself as a nurse. She knew what was normal and what wasn't. Everything was normal. At 5:27 in the afternoon, the baby was born. A girl. 6 pounds 9 ounces. Healthy and loud. When the nurse placed the baby in Sophie's arms, Sophie began to cry, deep, heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond exhaustion, beyond pain. Relief and joy and grief all mixed together. Evelyn stepped back, giving them space. The nurse asked if she wanted to hold the baby. Evelyn nodded. The baby was so small, so impossibly light. Evelyn looked down at her granddaughter and felt something crack open in her chest. This tiny creature had no idea what she'd been born into. No idea of the complications and betrayals that had preceded her arrival. She was just here, alive, perfect. They named her Grace. Daniel didn't call. Didn't text. The hospital listed him as the father on the birth certificate because Sophie provided his information, but he never came, never acknowledged the birth. Evelyn sent him a single text with a photo of the baby. She deserves the truth. He didn't reply. Sophie and Grace came home 3 days later. The house felt different now, full of new sounds, the baby's cries, Sophie's soft singing, the creak of the rocking chair in the nursery. Evelyn helped where she could, but mostly she gave Sophie space to learn how to be a mother. She brought meals, did laundry, held Grace when Sophie needed to shower or nap. They developed a rhythm, the 3 of them, a small unit functioning in quiet harmony. By September, life had settled into a new normal. Sophie was recovering well. Grace was thriving. The legal case moved forward slowly but steadily. Elizabeth filed for a formal divorce on Sophie's behalf, citing abandonment and seeking full custody with supervised visitation for Daniel. He filed a response through his lawyer, contesting nothing except the supervised visitation requirement. The court scheduled a hearing for November. One afternoon in late September, Evelyn received a letter from Marcus Lane. It was brief, handwritten on plain paper. Mrs. Mercer, I wanted to let you know that Daniel resigned from Tech Solutions last month. He left Denver before the Houston transfer could go through. I don't know where he went. No forwarding address was left. I thought you should know. I hope your daughter-in-law and the baby are doing well. Best regards, Marcus. Evelyn filed the letter in the folder and added a note to her timeline. September 24th, Daniel resigned from Tech Solutions, left Denver, no forwarding address. Pattern complete. Abandonment of wife, abandonment of job, disappearance from established life. She didn't tell Sophie immediately. There was no rush. The information wouldn't change anything. Sophie was focused on Grace, on learning to breastfeed, on managing the sleep deprivation that came with a newborn. Daniel's absence was already established. Knowing he literally disappeared just confirmed what Sophie already knew. He wasn't coming back. October arrived with cooler air and changing leaves. Evelyn took Sophie and Grace on walks around the neighborhood, pushing the stroller while Sophie walked beside her. Neighbors they passed cooed over the baby, congratulated Sophie, asked polite questions that Sophie answered with practiced vagueness. The father's not in the picture, she'd say, and people would nod sympathetically and change the subject. One evening, Lydia stopped by with dinner and spent an hour holding Grace while Sophie ate. You're doing amazing, Lydia told her. Both of you. I don't feel amazing. I feel like I'm barely holding it together. That's what it feels like. But look around. You have a healthy baby, a safe home, food on the table. You're doing better than barely holding together. You're thriving. After Lydia left, Sophie asked Evelyn, do you think I'm doing okay? Evelyn was washing dishes. She dried her hands and turned around. You're doing more than okay. You're doing everything right. It doesn't feel that way. It never does. Being a parent means constantly questioning yourself. But look at her, Evelyn gestured to Grace, asleep in her bassinet. She's fed, clean, safe, loved. What more could she need? Sophie nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you. For everything. You've thanked me enough. I know. But I don't think I'll ever thank you enough. The divorce hearing in November was anticlimactic. Daniel didn't appear. His lawyer submitted a filing stating that Mr. Mercer was unable to attend due to work commitments and requested the hearing be rescheduled. Elizabeth objected, arguing that Daniel had resigned from his previous employment and had no verifiable work commitments. The judge reviewed the documentation and denied the request for postponement. If Mr. Mercer chooses not to participate in these proceedings, that's his choice, the judge said. But I won't delay justice for a party who refuses to engage. The judge granted the divorce, awarding full custody of Grace to Sophie with no visitation rights for Daniel unless he petitioned the court and proved he could provide a stable environment. Child support was set at $1,200 per month, though the judge acknowledged collecting it might be difficult given Daniel's disappearance. The asset division was straightforward since most assets had been in Daniel's name alone. Sophie was awarded half the value of the joint bank account, about $3,000, and half the value of the retirement account Daniel had accrued during the marriage. The furniture in Denver and the car were Daniel's problems to deal with. When they left the courthouse, Sophie looked shell-shocked. It's really over. The legal part is, Evelyn said. The rest takes longer. That evening, they celebrated quietly with takeout pizza and ice cream. Grace lay in her bassinet, making soft baby sounds. Sophie kept looking at the divorce decree Elizabeth had given her, reading it over and over as if to confirm it was real. I keep thinking I should feel relieved, Sophie said. But I just feel sad. That's normal. You're mourning what you thought you had. What you thought it would be. Did you mourn? When will your husband die? Of course. But that was different. Death is final but blameless. Betrayal leaves room for anger. I think I'm too tired to be angry. The anger will come. Or maybe it won't. Either way is okay. By December, the case was officially closed. The final orders had been filed. Sophie's name was restored to her maiden name at her request. Grace's birth certificate listed Daniel as father but noted that custody was sole to mother. Everything was documented, signed, and filed away in manila folders that Evelyn kept on the top shelf of her closet. One afternoon, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Sophie said, "I want to tell her about him someday, when she's old enough to understand." They were in the living room. Grace was on a blanket on the floor, reaching for a soft toy. Evelyn was reading, but she set her book down. "What will you tell her?" "The truth. That he wasn't ready to be a father. That he made choices that hurt people. But also that I chose to have her anyway, and I don't regret that." "That's a good answer. Will you help me?" "When the time comes. If you want me to." Sophie reached over and squeezed Evelyn's hand. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have figured it out. You're stronger than you think." "Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to figure it out alone." Christmas that year was quiet. Evelyn hung lights on the porch and put up a small tree in the living room. Sophie made cookies. They didn't exchange gifts, there was no money for that, and it didn't matter anyway. Grace was the gift, her presence filling the house with new life and possibility. On Christmas morning, Grace rolled over for the first time. Sophie called for Evelyn, and they both watched as the baby flipped from her back to her belly, looking surprised by her own accomplishment. They clapped and cheered, and Grace smiled her gummy smile, delighted by the attention. In January, Sophie started looking for work. She applied for remote positions in marketing, leveraging her experience from before the marriage. She had 2 phone interviews, both of which went well. In February, she was offered a part-time position with a small company that made organic baby products. The hours were flexible, the pay was modest but sufficient, and she could work from home while Evelyn watched Grace. The arrangement worked. Sophie set up a workspace at the kitchen table. Evelyn took Grace for walks in the mornings, read to her in the afternoons, played with her on the living room floor while Sophie took client calls. It was tiring but manageable. And slowly, gradually, they began to build something new, not a replacement for what had been lost, but something different. Something better. By spring, Grace was pulling herself up on furniture, babbling constantly, and eating solid foods. She had Evelyn's eyes and Sophie's smile. She didn't look like Daniel at all, and no one ever mentioned it. One afternoon in April, a full year after that first late-night knock, Evelyn sat on the porch with a cup of tea and her notebook. She paged through it slowly, reading the timeline she'd constructed, the evidence she'd gathered, the careful documentation of Daniel's betrayal. She thought about adding a final entry, a conclusion, but she didn't know what to write. In the end, she wrote this: April 3rd, 1 year later. The case is closed. The legal battles are over. Daniel has disappeared entirely, no contact, no support payments, no acknowledgement of his daughter. Sophie is working and healing. Grace is thriving. The house is full of life again. Sometimes I hear that knock in my dreams, quick and desperate, 3 in the morning, a daughter-in-law with nowhere else to go. But when I wake, I realize the knock wasn't an ending. It was the beginning. Everything that came after, the documentation, the legal fights, the quiet reclamation of dignity and control, it was all necessary. Not for revenge. For clarity. For protection. For peace. She closed the notebook and set it aside. Inside, Sophie was singing to Grace, some made-up song about ducks and puddles. Evelyn listened, smiling. The sun was warm on her face. The birds were singing in the oak tree. Life went on, as it always did, with or without Daniel's participation. Later that week, Lydia stopped by for tea. They sat on the porch, watching Grace play in the grass. "You did good," Lydia said, taking her in, helping her through all this. "I did what anyone would do." "No. Most people wouldn't have been so calm. So methodical. You turned a crisis into a case study. Years of nursing. You learned to separate emotion from action. Still, you saved her. You know that, right?" Evelyn shrugged. She saved herself. I just gave her a place to stand while she did it. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their tea. After a while, Lydia said, "Have you heard from him? At all?" "No. Nothing. Do you think you ever will?" "I don't know. Maybe someday he'll resurface. Maybe he won't. Either way, we'll be fine. And they were fine. Better than fine. The house that had been so quiet in Evelyn's widowhood was now full of sound and life. Grace's laughter. Sophie's voice. The creak of the rocking chair. The hum of Sophie's laptop during work hours. The splash of bathwater in the evenings. The torn wedding invitation still lay pressed between the pages of Evelyn's Bible, but she rarely looked at it anymore. It had become simply a fact, a historical artifact marking a moment that no longer hurt. She kept it not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of resilience, of the night Sophie knocked, of the choice Evelyn made to open the door, of everything that followed. By summer, Sophie and Evelyn had settled into a partnership that felt permanent. They discussed getting a bigger house, something with a yard for Grace, but neither of them pushed the issue. The house on Maple Street had become home for all three of them. It was where Grace had taken her first steps, said her first words, celebrated her first birthday. It was where Sophie had rebuilt her life from nothing. It was where Evelyn had discovered that widowhood didn't mean loneliness, that loss could be followed by unexpected gifts. One evening in July, as Grace's second birthday approached, Sophie said, "I've been thinking about something." They were sitting on the porch, as had become their custom. Grace was inside, asleep. The evening was warm, the air heavy with the smell of cut grass. "What's that?" Evelyn asked. "I want to buy you out. Make this house ours officially. I've been saving, and with the settlement money and my salary, I can make payments. I want this to be our home, not just a temporary shelter." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This house has been in my name for 30 years. When I die, it'll go to Daniel." "I know. Unless I change my will." Sophie looked at her. "Would you?" "I've been thinking about it." He walked away from his responsibilities. He abandoned his daughter. "Why should he inherit anything from me?" "I don't want to profit from your death, Evelyn. That's not what this would be. This would be ensuring Grace has a home. Ensuring you have security. That's what family does." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "You think of us as family, don't you?" Sophie nodded, unable to speak. Evelyn reached over and squeezed her hand. "Then let's make it official. I'll talk to a lawyer about revising my will. You can buy the house from my estate eventually, but until then, it's your home. Grace's home. No strings attached." They sat together as darkness fell, listening to the crickets, feeling the warm breeze. Inside, Grace stirred but didn't wake. The house stood solid and quiet around them, sheltering them as it had sheltered so many others over the decades. In August, on Grace's second birthday, they had a small party in the backyard. Lydia came with a cake she'd made herself. A few neighbors stopped by with gifts. Grace wore a yellow dress and chased bubbles across the grass, laughing. Sophie took pictures, her face glowing with a happiness that seemed almost impossible given where they'd been 2 years ago. Evelyn stood at the edge of the yard, watching. She thought about Daniel, wherever he was, and felt only a distant sadness. He was missing this, the joy of his daughter's laughter, the satisfaction of watching her grow, the simple pleasure of a summer afternoon with family. He'd chosen to miss it, had walked away from it deliberately, and that was his loss. Not theirs. That evening, after everyone had gone home and Grace was in bed, Sophie found Evelyn sitting on the porch with her notebook. "What are you doing?" "Just closing the book." Evelyn showed her the last page, where she'd written a single sentence. August 12th, 2 years later. "We are happy. That is enough." Sophie smiled. "That is enough." Evelyn closed the notebook and stood. "Come on. Let's go inside." They went in together, turning off the porch light, locking the door. The house was warm and quiet. In the nursery, Grace slept peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Sophie stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter sleep. Evelyn stood beside her. "Thank you," Sophie whispered. "For what?" "For opening the door." Evelyn didn't respond with words. She simply put her arm around Sophie's shoulders, and they stood there together, two women who'd found each other in crisis and built something lasting from the wreckage. The years that followed were ordinary in the best way. Grace grew from a toddler to a little girl, starting preschool and making friends. Sophie's work expanded, and she was promoted twice. Evelyn aged gracefully, her hair turning completely white, her hands developing the arthritis she'd always known would come. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, weathered illnesses and minor crises, and through it all remained a unit. Daniel never reappeared. No calls, no letters, no surprise visits. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. Child support payments never materialized despite the court order. Elizabeth eventually filed paperwork to terminate his parental rights entirely, given his complete abandonment. The court granted it without opposition. Daniel was no longer legally Grace's father. He was no one. When Grace was 5, she asked about her father for the first time. Lily's dad came to school for Dad Day, she said one evening. Why don't I have a dad? Sophie and Evelyn had prepared for this question, had rehearsed answers, but now that it was here, Sophie found herself uncertain. Evelyn stepped in. Some families have a mom and a dad. Some have 2 moms or 2 dads. Some have just a mom or just a dad. Your family has a mom and a grandma who love you very much. That's what matters. Grace thought about this. Okay, and that was it. The question didn't come up again for years. By the time Grace was 10, she'd accepted her family structure as normal. She had friends with divorced parents, friends with same-sex parents, friends being raised by grandparents or aunts or uncles. Family came in all configurations. Hers was just one variation. One summer afternoon, when Grace was 12, she found the notebook. Evelyn had moved it from her desk drawer to a box in the closet, intending to throw it out but never quite managing to. Grace brought it to Evelyn. What's this? Evelyn took the notebook and paged through it. 12 years of distance made the entries feel almost archaeological, like artifacts from someone else's life. It's a record, she said finally, of how your mom came to live here. Can I read it? Evelyn looked at Sophie, who'd come into the room when she heard Grace's question. Sophie nodded. If Grandma's okay with it. You should ask your mom if she's okay with it, Evelyn said. It's her story more than mine. Sophie sat down beside Grace. You can read it. But some of it might be hard to understand. And some of it might be sad. Grace opened the notebook and began to read. Evelyn and Sophie left her alone, giving her space to process. An hour later, Grace found them in the kitchen. She looked confused and a little angry. He was mean to Mom. Yes, Sophie said. He was. Why? I don't know. People make choices that hurt others sometimes. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. I know that. But why would he not want me? Sophie pulled Grace into a hug. I don't know that either, sweetheart. But his choice had nothing to do with you. You are wanted. So wanted. Grace cried a little and Sophie cried with her, and Evelyn made hot chocolate even though it was summer, because sometimes hot chocolate was the only answer that made sense. Later, when Grace had gone to bed, Sophie said, I'm glad she knows. I was worried it would hurt her, but I think it's better to know the truth. Truth usually is better, Evelyn agreed. Even when it's painful. As Grace entered her teenage years, she occasionally asked questions about Daniel. Sophie answered honestly but without embellishment. Yes, they'd been married. Yes, he'd left when she was pregnant. No, she didn't know where he was now. No, she didn't think he'd ever come back. Grace seemed to accept this with a maturity beyond her years. I used to think maybe he'd show up one day and apologize, she said once. But now I don't care if he does. I have you and Grandma. That's enough. And it was. More than enough. Evelyn lived to see Grace graduate high school, watched her head off to college with a scholarship to study environmental science. She lived to see Sophie promoted to director at her company, watched her daughter-in-law bloom into confidence and success. She lived to see the house on Maple Street repainted, the kitchen renovated, the garden expanded. When Evelyn died at 79, peacefully in her sleep, her will was clear. The house went to Sophie. Her savings went to Grace's education fund. Her few possessions were divided between them. There was no provision for Daniel, no acknowledgement that he'd ever existed. At the memorial service, held in the backyard she'd tended for decades, Sophie spoke about Evelyn's kindness, her wisdom, her calm strength in the face of crisis. Grace, now 21 and impossibly grown, spoke about the grandmother who'd always been there, who'd taught her that family was chosen as much as given, that love was action rather than sentiment. After the service, after everyone had gone home, Sophie and Grace sat on the porch together. The house felt different without Evelyn in it, hollow somehow. But her presence lingered in every corner, in the garden she'd planted, in the worn armchair she'd favored, in the hundreds of small kindnesses that had shaped their lives. "She saved us," Grace said quietly. "We saved each other," Sophie replied. That's what she would say. They sat until dark, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. Inside the house, everything Evelyn had built remained, the order she'd created, the documentation of justice achieved, the quiet legacy of a woman who'd chosen compassion over bitterness, clarity over revenge. And somewhere in a box in the closet, a blue notebook held the story of how it all began. A desperate knock in the night, a door opened, a choice made to offer shelter when shelter was all that was left to give. It wasn't a story of revenge or triumph. It was a story of survival, of methodical protection, of love expressed through action rather than words. It was, in the end, simply a story of what family meant, not the family you were born into, but the family you built, one careful choice at a time, until the knock that had once been desperate became a homecoming. Until the shelter that had been temporary became permanent, until the silence that had been heavy with pain transformed into peace. The house on Maple Street stood quiet in the darkness, holding its stories close, waiting for the next chapter to begin. Every story here will stir your soul. Welcome to Spice and Sugar, your daily escape into real emotions, bold lives, and unforgettable lessons. Here, it's all about love, loss, laughter, and the quiet strength that carries us through. I share stories that make you feel, that remind you you're not alone, that every bitter moment can lead to something sweet. If you want to laugh, cry, and see life through stories that heal and inspire, subscribe and stay a while.